Hello friends! Welcome to a new Happy Learning video. Today we're going to learn about the Roman Empire. Legend has it that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, two brothers who had been raised by a wolf. But that's just a legend. Rome was founded almost 2,800 years ago with the union of several villages in Italy. At first, it was a monarchy. Those who commanded were the kings, but later it became a republic. Do you know what that is? A republic is a form of government where there are no kings, but politicians make the decisions they think are convenient. The Republic of Rome lasted several centuries until about 2,000 years ago, when what we know as the Roman Empire began. In an empire, all power is in the hands of an emperor, who is like the king of kings. The Romans conquered all the nations of the Mediterranean: Greece, Egypt, Syria, France, Germany, and also the Iberian and Celtic people of Hispania. They even arrived in Britannia, now known as England. But how did the Romans live? Roman society was divided into several groups. The patricians were the nobles. They had a lot of power. They were politicians and military men, rich and powerful. Below them were the plebeians, the people. They were farmers, artisans, and workers in general. And finally, in the lowest part were the slaves, who used to be the prisoners of war. War was a very important activity for the Romans. Their armies were huge and formed by fearsome soldiers called legionaries. Thanks to them, they conquered all corners of the Mediterranean. The Romans were also great engineers and architects, and created very orderly cities with many amenities. They had aqueducts to carry water from one place to another, bridges to cross rivers, circuses, theatres, spas, and schools. Roman children went to school, like us. They also built roads, and this made it a lot easier to get from one side of the empire to the other. The Roman Empire ended in the 5th century when the Germans invaded Rome. It was at that very moment, with the fall of the empire, when the Middle Ages began. But that's another story. As we always tell you, it is very important to know the past, to understand the present and improve the future, don't you think? Goodbye, friends! And don't forget to subscribe to Happy Learning TV.
Hello friends, welcome to a new Happy Learning video. Today, we're going to meet the era of castles, kings and queens, noblemen and vassals. Today, we're going to get to know the medieval ages. The medieval ages commenced in the year 476 with the fall of the Roman Empire and finished in 1492 with the discovery of America. In medieval times, the great territory dominated by the Roman Empire in Europe broke in many different ways. And in many of them, a monarchy was born, which is a form of government when a king or queen is in power. Royalty had absolute power and received their authority because of the feudal system. This system was based on a pyramidal structure. Royals were the most powerful of all, at the very top. Noblemen were just under, formed by counts, dukes, barons and other gentlemen and ladies that controlled territories. Under these were the vassals, who worked and lived in the lands dominated by the noblemen and gave part of their work in exchange for protection and help. When they were attacked by enemies, vassals would run to the noble's castle. Vassals were farmers, shepherds, craftsmen and soldiers who were considered free men. In the lower part of the pyramid, the poor and slaves were found, who were often war prisoners and would do the toughest jobs in exchange for nothing. Christianity was the religion that dominated Europe during the medieval ages, and its power was tremendous. Only the Pope in Rome was on top of the kings. The Pope acted like another king. He controlled territories, formed alliances, and declared war. The most important wars were the Crusades, where European knights and their troops tried to dominate the sacred land, dominated by Muslims. Islam was the other great religion during this time, and confrontation between Muslims and Christians was constant. Although medieval times are referred to as dark times, in reality it was very different. In monasteries, monks conserved and developed olden times' knowledge, and the first universities in Europe were established during this period in history. The truth is that medieval ages are a fascinating era in history, don't you think? Goodbye, happy friends, and don't forget to subscribe to Happy Learning TV.
About 18 months ago, James heard one of his favorite podcasters say he was making podcasting his full-time gig, and we've wanted to help out ever since. Coordinating our schedules was almost comically difficult. But now that Rob's brand new miniature member of his family has arrived, we're sending him on some much-needed paternity leave to bond with his daughter. Congrats, Rob! In his stead, please welcome David Crowther from the always excellent History of England podcast. David's going to be reading for this series, so you can get a sample of the dulcet and beautifully British tone of his voice. And after the ep, be sure to go check out his podcast at the link in the description. So without further ado, take it away, David.
Thank you very much, Matthew. The 100 Years' War, the pageants and tournaments of chivalry, knights in burnished armour, the English archer destroying the flower of French chivalry, the great battles of Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, or just a sign of the brutality of the Middle Ages, senseless warfare and destruction, the death of thousands in the mud of France for nothing more than the greed and ambition of kings. There's all of this and more in the 100 Years' War. It's a story of courage, the clash of nations, a story of human endeavour and the timeless struggle for supremacy. Yet there's also another story here, the story of a war that helped define England, her sense of herself, her language, her role in the world. The 100 Years' War helped form a nation. Welcome to the Extra History of England. It's 1328. The new King of England is a young man called Edward III. But he's powerless, because his mother's lover, a man named Roger Mortimer, had seized control of his throne. But Edward was a warrior and a leader of men. In 1330, at the age of only 17, he gathered some friends and by pale moonlight snuck into Mortimer's castle. He cut down the guards and seized Mortimer himself. The interloper was dragged through the jeering crowds of London, dragged to the gallows known as the Tyburn Tree, where countless traitors would die over the centuries and hung by the neck until dead. From that point, Edward was determined that England and his royal court would be a shining example of culture to all Christendom. The court of the young king was a pageant of colour, music, tournaments and poetry. He surrounded himself with the enormously wealthy nobility and modelled his court on the glory of the ancient and mythical Camelot, of King Arthur, a celebration of the cult of chivalry. But part of that cult was that the king would lead his nobles to war, wealth and glory. And while at times the nobility did strain against the king's authority, for the most part they were his natural allies, holding their lands from him and working with him to govern his kingdom and his people. And so, with his greatest nobles at his side, Edward did what he loved most and was born for. He led his nobility to war and crushed the Scots in battle. But then in 1337, Edward's world was threatened. The French were at the gates. Well, not the literal gates. Actually, it's a complex dynastic claim involving several hundred years of medieval inheritance law and international politics. We should be able to cover that in just a few sentences. For centuries, the French and English royal dynasties had fought over land in France. In the blue corner, the French royal dynasty, the Valois, and in the red corner, the English royal dynasty, the Plantagenets. and the Valois King of France, King Philip VI of France, was determined to take the last of Edward's French lands away from him. Because medieval kingdoms didn't follow modern borders or rules. They were the property of a king and his nobles. English claims in France went all the way back to 1066, when a French noble called William the Bastard decided that he deserved more than the lands he held in Normandy. He made the most of a distant claim to the English throne, sailed across the Channel, beat up the English and became known to history as William the Conqueror. The old Anglo-Saxon landowners were swept away, and England became the property of French-speaking lords. French was the language of the nobility, of literature, of the king's court. English was the language of the peasant and the serf. Fast forward 100 years, and in 1155, a young man called Henry became King Henry II of England. Henry came from Anjou in France, and so more French land was added to those holdings in Normandy that came from old Billy the Conk. Plus, Henry then married the richest heiress in Europe, always a good way of paying the bills, the powerful, cultured and intelligent Eleanor of Aquitaine. And she brought even more French land to the English crown. Henry and his successors, the Plantagenet royal family, now owned almost half of modern France. They spoke French, they loved France, they were French. If they had to choose between a croissant and a full English breakfast, it'd be the croissant every time. But there's a catch. Most of these lands were in theory still owned by the kings of France. Like all medieval vassals, everyone with lands in France was supposed to kneel and pay homage to the Valois kings for them. In practice, though, the likes of Billy the Conk and Henry II were simply too powerful to be forced to do what the Valois told them to do. So they just paid lip service to the French king's theoretical rights and got on with the party. But over the centuries, bit by bit, the Valois had used their rights to take back most of that land while weaker Plantagenets were on the English throne. By the time Edward III was born, most of those lands had been successfully reclaimed by the French, leaving only a single province left in English hands, a place called Gascony. The Valois king, Philip VI, was determined to take that last province away from the Plantagenets and England. Philip had no doubt he could achieve this. After all, France was the most powerful and glorious country in all Christendom. It was one of the leading centres of culture and learning. Philip only counted as his equals the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and that's it. England was just a small, damp and slightly grubby country somewhere in the North Sea. The French nobility were the shining exemplar of chivalry, while the English nobility were not. Philip made trouble for Edward. He made an alliance with the Scots against the English, and then at his court in 1337 he formally confiscated Gascony. Edward tried to talk. Philip told him to talk to the hand. Edward told him to talk to the edge of his sword. He would defend his rights. The confiscation was not just an insult to Edward. It was also a threat to English merchants. England had two great sources of wealth. One was in the wine trade with Gascony. The Gascon merchants as well as the English hated the idea of losing the wine trade with England. Even more important, though, was the wool trade, with the county of Flanders in the modern-day Belgium. The textile industry was far and away the biggest industry in medieval Europe other than agriculture. No other industry was a fraction of its value, and the textile industry was dominated by the densely populated towns of northern Italy and Flanders. English wool fed that trade. English wool was the best in all Europe, finer, with longer strands making it easier to turn into yarn and creating the softest, strongest woolen cloth. Every year, thousands of huge wool sacks were sold to Flemish merchants, and every year customs dues from the trade filled the English treasury. But the Count of Flanders was a subject of the French king, and now King Philip told Flanders they could no longer trade with the English. The Flemish were as horrified as the English. Without English wool, their industry would die and their people would starve. So one Friday, in the bustling market square in Ghent in Flanders, the people gathered excitedly round a wooden stage. It was covered with colourful pennants and flags. But they saw a new flag, the arms of England quartered with the royal arms of France, and they wondered what that could mean. A young, powerful man stepped forward. His name, he declared, was King Edward III. He had been wrongfully banned from his lands in France, and he would reclaim his right. The people cheered. But there was more. By the right of his French mother, he was claiming the very throne of France itself. The Flemish cheered. The French giggled. War was now unstoppable. At stake on the English side was trade, the English role in Christendom, the king's lands in France held by right for 150 years, and the reputation and honour of the king. On the French side, a unified country, national prestige, and the right of their monarch to his throne. So join us next time as these two great kings marshal their forces and the 100 Years' War begins in earnest.
Broadly speaking, the Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement, largely based in Europe, that spanned about a century, from the mid to late 1600s to the late 1700s. Some of the most well-known thinkers associated with the Enlightenment include John Locke, Adam Smith, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, among others. The Enlightenment was a time of major intellectual upheaval, characterized by the rise of reason and the scientific method as tools for understanding the world and bringing about progress. Prior to the Enlightenment, Europe was dominated by religious and political absolutism. But the ideas that emerged during the Enlightenment represented a totally new way of thinking about rights, freedom, liberty, justice, and government, and directly challenged the absolute power of monarchs and the church. As a result, many Enlightenment thinkers had their works banned by governments and church leaders because of the radical ideas they advocated. Ideas that would ultimately lay the foundation for the liberal democratic institutions that we take for granted today, including impartial courts and the rule of law, democratically elected governments, separation of church and state, equality for all people, and freedom of speech and freedom of religion, just to name a few. But the Enlightenment didn't just bring about significant changes in philosophical and political thought. Thinkers such as Adam Smith and David Hume also introduced radical new economic ideas that explained the rise of market economies, and with it, increasing material prosperity, all of which helped spark even greater change across Europe and North America. The revolutionary movements and experiments in government in the United States and France were both directly influenced by the ideas of liberty, freedom, limited government, and the separation of church and state that were hallmarks of the Enlightenment thinkers.
Industrial Revolution, 18th to 19th century. The economic developments of the 1800s saw the development of agrarian and handicraft economies in Europe and America transform into industrial urbanized ones. The term to describe this phenomenon would be known as the Industrial Revolution, and was first used by French writers, but made popular by English economic historian Arnold Toynbee. The Industrial Revolution was underpinned by the Agricultural Revolution. From the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century, agricultural production increased significantly. The huge increase in food output supported the expansion and sustained a large population and boosted trade. The increased use of machines over human or animal power in farming also meant that less farm workers were needed, and they could leave the land to industrial towns. Better metals and richer fuel also contributed to industrialization by creating the steam engine, an integral machine to industrialization which powered factories, locomotives, and ships. The new steam engines used coal and iron, both in their construction and as fuel, increasing demand for these resources. Roads, canals, and railways changed Britain dramatically, connecting Britain and allowing goods to be sent over long distances. Visually, the revolution was clear in the new industrial towns, with smoking factories dominating the skyline. The cities were horrible to live in, overcrowded and dirty with dangerous conditions in the factories and strict rules and punishments. The Industrial Revolution saw mechanization in factories of the textile industry, which was previously manufactured in the home, creating the term cottage industry. Now, production could be increased on a large scale because of new inventions such as the spinning mule and the power loom. The iron industry developed with Henry Bessemer's inexpensive process for mass-producing steel. Iron and steel were key materials for constructing the tools and machinery, steam engines, and ships needed for the industrial progress. Industrial labor opportunities drew people to the cities from the countryside, to such an extent that in 1750 only 15% of the population of Britain lived in towns. By 1850, over 50% of the entire population of Great Britain lived in either a town or a city, and by 1900 it was 85%. London had 4.5 million people, Glasgow 760,000, Liverpool 685,000, and Manchester and Birmingham 500,000. Great Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and was the only mature industrial economy for a long time. Historians have speculated that this was because, as an island, there was relative peace and stability for Britain compared to mainland Europe. Rather than spending on a large defensive standing army, capital could be spent on other ventures, and there was confidence for investors. Native resources were also abundant and readily available for initial technological developments and inventions. Engineers and inventors were also respected and encouraged in British society and were backed by wealthy patrons. A powerful navy and an empire bringing in vast wealth from its colonies also contributed to the catalyst for industrialization before others. Nevertheless, Germany, France, Switzerland, Belgium and the United States soon emulated Britain's industrial change, and by 1900, Britain would no longer be at the top, with the United States as the world's leading industrial nation in the 20th century.
Subscribe for more history videos. Thank you for all your support on the Simple History YouTube channel. If you enjoy the channel, please consider supporting us at Patreon.
That's my great-grandpa Timothy. I was named after him. He was a medic in World War I. I don't know who he was named after. Dear Tim and Moby, why was World War I called the Great War? From Abby. No, it wasn't a fun time. People called it the Great War because World War I was bigger than any war that came before it. A lot of new military technology like airplanes, submarines, machine guns, heavy artillery, and even poison gas were used during World War I. This new technology made for a lot of casualties. 9 million soldiers died, and 23 million more were wounded. Well, it all started on June 28, 1914, when a Serbian man assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Ferdinand was in line to be king of Austria-Hungary, a powerful empire in the center of Europe. A month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. It's complicated. Before World War I, there was a lot of tension brewing in Europe. Different countries were competing for land and power. It was really just a matter of time before war broke out. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, all the other countries started choosing sides. Russia had an alliance with Serbia, so it joined the war. An alliance is an agreement between two or more countries to help each other out. Europe had so many alliances going on that what began as a conflict between two countries became a huge war between many. On one side, the Allied powers included Serbia, France, Belgium, Russia, and Great Britain. On the other side, the Central Powers were Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Most of the fighting took place in Belgium and France, with the German army doing most of the work for the Central Powers. Up-close fighting in trenches called trench warfare was a big part of World War I. Battles raged on without either side gaining an inch. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 lasted for months. Some 300,000 soldiers died, and about 1 million more were injured, and the Allies gained less than 10 kilometers of land. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, tried to keep the U.S. out of the war. Along with many Americans, he saw this as a European conflict and wanted nothing to do with it. But two major events forced him to enter the war. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine sank a British ocean liner called the Lusitania, and 128 American civilians died. In February of 1917, the Zimmermann telegram was discovered. The German government was asking Mexico to join the war. In return, Germany would help Mexico take a bunch of southwestern states back from the United States. Also, an internal revolution caused Russia to pull out of the war in 1917, making the Allied forces desperate for help. The U.S. entered the war on the side of the Allies in April of 1917. Congress passed the Selective Service Act, saying that all men between the ages of 21 and 31 had to sign up for military service. The U.S. drafted 3 million people. That included 350,000 African Americans. Most American soldiers fought in France. With the help of America, the Allies started winning. Big battles like the Argonne and the Second Battle of the Marne pushed the German armies back. On November 11, 1918, the Germans agreed to an armistice, or ceasefire. The Treaty of Versailles made Germany accept blame for the war and pay the Allies $33 billion in war reparations. President Wilson argued for less harsh measures in his famous 14-point plan for peace, but he was overruled. Many historians believe that the Treaty of Versailles was partly to blame for World War II 20 years later. Please don't do that.
A brief overview of World War II. The war in Europe began in September 1939, when Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. Using blitzkrieg tactics, the country was quickly overtaken. The world was shocked. Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany, but took little action. This became known as the Phony War. But in 1940, German offensives rapidly defeated Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The British Army, meanwhile, was on the retreat, being evacuated from Dunkirk. Britain, alone, was attacked by Germany during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. However, the Luftwaffe failed to defeat the RAF. In June 1941, Hitler invaded Russia under the codename Operation Barbarossa, and in December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the USA into the war. Germany, Italy, and Japan formed the Axis powers, while Britain, Russia, and the USA made up the major combatants on the Allied side. In 1942, the Nazis implemented their final solution, a plan to exterminate all Jewish people. Critical battles followed that would dramatically change the course of the war. These were Midway in the Pacific Theatre, June 1942, El Alamein in Egypt, November 1942, and Stalingrad in Russia, January 1943. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, invading Normandy, France. The Red Army advanced in the east and was the first to reach the German capital of Berlin. Germany surrendered in May 1945, shortly after Adolf Hitler committed suicide. On 6th of August 1945, the Americans dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Japan surrendered on VJ Day, 15th of August 1945. The war was over. World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945 and remains the most geographically widespread military conflict the world has ever seen. Subscribe to see more fun history videos. Get your copy of Simple History, World War II, out today.
The Cold War was a conflict that began at the end of the Second World War in 1945. The end of the war marked the end of the supremacy of Europe. Two powers took over: the United States and the Soviet Union, leading two blocs with their own alliances and satellite states, the so-called Western Bloc, capitalist, and the Eastern Bloc, communist. Why was it called the Cold War? Because neither of the two blocs ever took direct actions against the other. It wasn't a normal war, although there were derivative conflicts and subsidiary wars. The reasons for this conflict were essentially ideological, political, economic, and for propaganda purposes. The Soviet Union financed and supported revolutions and socialist governments, while the United States gave open support and propagated destabilization and coups in Latin America. The history of the Cold War starts before 1945, specifically in 1917, after the triumph of the Russian Revolution, from which Russia emerged as the first socialist country. This was one of the first events that provoked considerable erosions in Russian-American relations. The Soviets argued that capitalism must be overthrown by force and be replaced by a communist system. The American capitalists, after the outbreak of the revolution, helped the White Army during the Russian Civil War. Finally, the Red Army troops led by Trotsky claimed the victory. But let's go back to 1945. After the end of the Second World War, we need to remember that the Soviet Union and the United States had been allies to stop Hitler's plans. Before the war was over, they met in Yalta. Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt as heads of government of the USSR, the United Kingdom, and the United States respectively. The Yalta Conference was followed by the Potsdam Conference, with Germany already totally defeated and Hitler dead. These conferences involved the division of Germany into 4 zones, one part for each country and one part for France. Issues of disarmament, demilitarization, the return of territories annexed by Germany, the hunting down of Nazi war criminals, and the creation of the United Nations were also discussed. The Soviets after the war had de facto occupied the areas of Eastern Europe that they had defended and liberated. To stop this Soviet expansion, the United States with the Marshall Plan helped Western Europe and the western part of Germany to get back to normal. With the Marshall Plan, the Americans gave enormous economic aid to Europe. The plan was operational for 4 years from 1948. The United States' objectives were to rebuild the areas destroyed by the war, eliminate trade barriers, modernize European industry, and make the continent prosperous again. All these objectives aimed to prevent the spread of communism, which had a large and growing influence in post-war Europe. The detractors of the Marshall Plan argue that this was an example of US economic imperialism. The United States promoted the founding of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an intergovernmental military alliance sealed in 1949. The organization was a system of collective defense in which the member states agree to defend any of their members if they are attacked by an external faction. The rival nations, to counteract the strength of this alliance, signed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Finally, Berlin, Europe, and the world were divided by the Iron Curtain. This expression was coined by Churchill. In 1949, the Red Army of Mao Zedong was proclaimed winner of the Chinese Civil War after defeating the Kuomintang nationalists who were supported by the United States. The Soviet Union immediately establishes an alliance with the victors who had created a new communist state called the People's Republic of China. The following year, Stalin was caught by surprise by the participation of US troops in the defense of South Korea that had been invaded by the North Korean communists. The ceasefire came in 1953. Stalin had died that same year. He will be succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. Let's go back to the Iron Curtain in Europe. In the 5 years after the Second World War, a total of 50 million people emigrated from east to west. This fact caused the Soviet bloc to carry out an effective emigration blockade in 1950. There was a very tight control of passports so that people couldn't go from one block to the other. The border in Berlin, a city that was divided, was a sieve, and many people left the communist side to go to the capitalist side. This led to the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. We must remember that Germany was divided after the war in 2 Germanys, the German Federal Republic with its capital in Bonn and the German Democratic Republic with its capital in Berlin. This division of the world into 2 blocks was maintained because of the risk of the 2 powers annihilating each other in a nuclear war. This forced both sides to exercise great caution in the most conflictive areas. The conflict nearly erupted, but only once, after the overthrow of the military leader Batista in Cuba by Fidel Castro. The United States tried to carry out an invasion of Cuba, but failed. In 1962, the so-called missile crisis occurred when President Kennedy punished Cuba with the blockade of the Soviet ships that were carrying missiles that were directed against the United States. At the last moment, Khrushchev, head of the party and the Soviet government, gave in and the ships changed course. The US had also entered the Vietnam War, which in the end turned out to be another hard setback in American history, where they experienced failure, exhaustion, and frustration. This conflict confronted the US and the government of South Vietnam on the one hand against North Vietnam and the communist guerrillas that acted in South Vietnam on the other. The war also ended up extending to Laos and Cambodia. The Cold War was also espionage, reciprocal inspections, conferences, crises, and diplomatic solutions. And let's not forget the space race, a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that led to a display of power and muscle. The Russians put the Sputnik satellite into orbit in 1957. The Americans immediately responded with their Explorer 1 in 1958. It was a matter of prestige. When the Russians sent their first man into space, the Americans took their revenge by sending a manned spaceship to the moon. In 1980, Reagan won the election, promising to increase military spending and take on the Soviets wherever it was necessary. Both Reagan and the newly elected British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, constantly denounced the communist ideology. Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire and predicted that communism would be left on the ash heap of history. In early 1985, Reagan's visceral anti-communism developed into a policy known as the Reagan Doctrine, in which, in addition to containment, he expressed the rights of the US to subvert and overthrow existing communist governments. Finally, in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, which means the definite opening up of the borders between the two blocs, the dismemberment of the Communist bloc, and the end of the Iron Curtain and the Cold War. After the fall, the tension between the old communist countries and the capitalist countries would end up being diluted. In fact, at present, most of the states of the former communist bloc have embraced the policies and ideologies of the capitalist world.